So welcome, Chapter 8. One of my favorite chapters is Internal Control in the IT Environment. And I'm really excited about this chapter because as you all know me pretty well, I do enjoy discussing IT. So when we record the nature of IT systems, we consider that particular nature. We have different sizes of business. So a lot of times, for those who are just getting started in a small business, and a lot of times with small business, you run into a situation where someone didn't really plan on having a business. Maybe they had an interesting idea or they saw an opportunity. And usually what happens is they don't particularly want to spend a lot of money to get set up, and because they're not sure if it's going to work. And then 6 months later, they're trying to go through their personal account and figure out where all the money has been spent. And I've seen that more than you can ever imagine. So a lot of times, QuickBooks in particular really has a great starter program for small businesses that's very understandable. Also, a small business may just go down to Best Buy or get online and use a off-the-shelf software package to get their IT started. Now, once a business becomes large and established, they have something called a client-server kind of architecture, which is basically a situation where you go and you have several offices, you have several people working, and they all exist under a large server, which is usually kind of like a large computer that can connect directly into the internet. And then, of course, there's enterprise resource planning. So the idea of ERP is that when you order something from one department or when you make a move in one area of business, that it's all connected and every department knows what the other department is doing. And then finally, most recently, there's cloud computing. Computing that is seamless, it's not tied down to a server, which presents its own security and accounting challenges. So let's look at the major components of an IT system. And for those of you who are well versed in IT, you can go in and maybe you want to skip this portion of the lecture. For those of you who aren't, let's just talk about the components as they stand. So we have the hardware, which is the physical computers, the physical server, the physical components of the office with regards to information technology. We have the software, which is the programs and the systems, the applications. We have the data, which is the input as the business is going in and as the business is doing its functional work. We're collecting information, we're collecting accounting journal entries. We have the people, which are using the IT, the procedures in place, which we talk about a lot in this chapter, and networks to keep everybody connected. Those are the major components of the IT system. So software, there's two types of software. There is system software that coordinates all the hardware components, which are all the physical workstations, and provides support to application software. And the example of this would be your operating system, your Unix, Windows, Mac OS. These are all our system software. Then there's the application software, which is designed to perform a specific task and is usually written in a programming language like Java. Okay, so we talk about the characteristics of systems. There's so many different ones for decision support, enterprise-wide, management information, transaction processing systems, like a cash register. And what we focus on in auditing and accounting is we particularly look at the things that support business activities, like sales and purchasing. And we also look at the company-wide enterprise resource systems and the flow of information through them. So just no matter how big or how small the processes are, they all have some of at least one of these characteristics. They either have what's called a batch or real-time processing. Batch is when you only run the information once at the end of the night. And I think of like credit card receipts that come in from a business, and at the night time they do the nightly close and run through all the credit card receipts at the end of the night. Basically goes into Visa, MasterCard, and closes out for the night. They can do it online in real time, and they can run their receipts as they're coming in. A lot of people do that. It's a little more efficient. And then, of course, you have to have some sort of database or some place to store the information. And of course, they can also have either a client server environment, they can have it in the cloud, or they can use e-commerce. All right, so again, talking about batch, the idea that you accumulate all the day's transactions and process them at the end of the day. Often it's more efficient to run a batch because it goes quickly instead of having to go in and wait for each transaction to go through separately. It's a quick and easy run. The problem is it doesn't provide up-to-minute information throughout the day. It's only at a point in time. Online capabilities. So there's two online systems allow the users to get access to data stored in the system, and there's two types. And I see these acronyms all the time. So if anything, I hope you out of my class understand these acronyms, so when you see them out in the wild or out in the real world, you'll know what they are. So the first one is online transaction processing. It's OLTP. I wish I could even make that bigger in the screen. And the idea is individual transactions are entered from remote locations. So if you think of like an ice cream shop, for example, Cold Stone Creamery, and you go in and you order a nice little scoop of ice cream. When you fill that information in, if you use the iPad or whatever, that transaction will be entered in right there at the point of sale. However, the other thing that is going on in the background is that there's a real-time experience where Visa, MasterCard is updating that person's credit and so on, and is approving or disapproving that transaction. So the idea is that the transaction can be entered from any remote location. That's your OLTP. Now, OLAP, Online Analytical Processing. That enables a user to query a system for analysis. So that would be your data analytics. So if you want to pull out, for example, you want to say, how many customers do we have in Houston, Texas? You could pull a report. If you want to use a decision support system like Salesforce, that's another way you can go in and use online analytical processing. So database storage. So you have all this information about your customers, master files. What happens when you go to your hard drive and you hit save as and you store it in your hard drive at work? Well, that means that it's in your computer, but nobody else knows what's going on. So in order to allow other people to know what's happening and they can make smart decisions, and also it's redundancy. So let's say you go out and you're a salesperson and you get some information about a customer and you save it in your contacts in your phone, and then 2 weeks later, because you chose not to share the information or forgot, another person also goes out and meets with the same customer because they didn't know what was going on, or he or she didn't know what was going on. That's another redundancy, and these redundancies are what happen in large multinational corporations and large businesses that don't have a strong IT program. These redundancies cost inefficiencies, variances, and they cost the companies a lot of money. It's also a security issue because you have several information's only stored to one person, that person could take the customer and walk off and start their own company. So those are things that kind of come in with storage. So if you store the information, instead of hitting file, save as, and storing it on your own individual computer, if you store it in some sort of database, then, like for example, and I'm throwing out Salesforce a lot here, if you store it there, then what happens is everybody knows what's going on, and a data administrator's job is to guard the security of the database. So this second scenario, you get the customer, you're out working, you save it in a database, and then the next time someone runs into that same customer, they're going to be careful not to go and visit your customer. Okay, so we talk about end user computing, and basically what end user computing is just exactly like it sounds. So each department develops their own applications, and that can come up in a small business where, for example, like accounting is separated from sales, is separated from other aspects of the business. So for example, I would say that like a smaller business, a little more traditional company might consider using end user computer. So for example, like the accounting department develops QuickBooks, and then maybe I'm thinking off the top of my head something like where the church pastor has his own program for developing sermons and content, and then the accountant has their own program. So what happens with end user computing is that the actual definition is the department is responsible for developing and executing their own IT applications, their own programs to get their jobs done. The problem is there is not an IT department that oversees that type of computing, and also they don't necessarily talk to each other. They transmit information sporadically. So just using an example of that, what if the accountant asked the pastor for a list of parishioners to check something? Well, the pastor would have to run his or her program, and then the accountant would have to run his or her program, and then they would have to marry the information. So end user computing is out there. Sometimes it's not as necessarily as efficient as having everybody on one program. The other thing is the controls in place for protecting that kind of information are the responsibility of the department. So the pastor has to make sure that his or her information is safe, and then the accounting department is responsible for that. So sometimes in a small business, this would be an example of everybody kind of using the program that works. Okay, so the next thing we talk about is networks. So networks are linked together through communication links, and we have a wide area network and a local area network. We have the intranet, the intranet, and the extranet. And one of the things I want to point out is there are two different ways. You can put it up in the cloud, where you don't necessarily need to do a local network, or you can leave it within an office. So for example, if you wanted to have this inter-office email within like a dentist's office, then that would be basically within the office. The problem is if there's someone in the office or there's some sort of hacking into that network, and that presents specific IT issues. So we talk about client server environment, and that would be used in a large company. And the idea is it's configured to separate the presentation, the processing, and the data functions in a kind of a 3-tier configuration. So it basically breaks everything up. And then of course, now pretty much everybody's rolling into the cloud. So with IT and the audit trail, the system can either be on in-house or off-premises. For security reasons, a lot of people choose to keep their stuff off-premises. There's all different ways you can do your IT system. You can either have, and in this illustration, they show the difference between the manual and automated transactions. And So if it's automated, everything would be electronic, obviously. Um, and there's things that they can do in both the automated and the manual area to, again, break internal controls or, uh, you know, potentially perpetrate a fraud. So you have to kind of look at that. Uh, Everything in IT rolls the same way we've talked about in the control environment. Nothing has been diminished, even in a computerized environment. I think sometimes people get a false sense of security for that. But it's with cyber crime and the need for cyber security, it's really important to continue to maintain internal control because there are a lot of ways that people can get scammed. The other thing that they talk about, other responsibilities, information systems management. So if you have an IT manager in place, they are to supervise and report usually to the VP of Finance, sometimes to the controller. Systematic analysis, they have to keep, they are responsible for the design of the system. I'm going to stop right there and say that not everybody who does this design knows about accounting, and that's where you have to step in. I've seen so many people come in and just trust IT to get it done because they themselves don't know anything about computers, and then we have all sorts of messes. So it's important that you bring your input in with your accounting information and your knowledge. And then finally, they're responsible for planning and administering the company database and verifying data input. These are just some of the responsibilities that you can have. So I don't want to spoil you anything, but we have a case coming up in week 3 that will be addressing computer-based fraud. So as you're reading this slide and you're doing the extra discussion on this, look for things from Chapter 2 that will apply to Chapter 3 regarding the breakdowns of internal control. So keep some notes on this. That'll help you make a really nice discussion in week 3. And one of the things that they put in the book is the internal audit should participate in the design of an IT-based system. And that's very important because a lot of times in these businesses, the administration does not want to try to understand the IT, and the IT has really no understanding of the accounting and auditing function. So it's important that everybody gets together. So here are the breakdown of the activities for the IT control. And they've got it between application and user controls. And it's a very nice breakdown in the fact, there's an overall general control related to all computer activities, and those would be important in that, just maintaining a system of controls for both hardware and software. And then we have program applications, so there's control in the function. Gateways, so that only certain people with authority can come in and get things. Then there are, then they have at the very bottom, you've got manual applications. So whenever you go to a computer and you only get a certain number of characters to type into a box, or you have a drop-down box on certain things, and you're kind of pigeonholed into this information, or you're not allowed to give a customer a refund without authorization. So then, I've seen this in the store where the employee raises their hand, the boss comes over without giving a second moment, goes and overrides the control. So anytime that happens, either you don't type something incorrectly or you override control, those would create exception reports that an IT audit department would look at. And then, of course, there's user control activities to look at the output against a source document. So in this case, we have maybe they put the right number of spaces in the application, but we want to check and make sure they put in the correct amount. So other activities include acquisition, development, maintenance, and security access. Okay, so we talk about application controls. And earlier I talked about the validity, like you can't come in and put a certain number of spaces in your answer, or it has to be alphanumeric entry. And the reason why is because hackers often use funny characters to pull and break databases. So you want to be looking for that. A lot of databases, there's this thing called SQL injection. If I have time in class, I'll share an article with you about SQL injection that goes into how you can break a database. So I might actually just share that with the class. Batch controls. So we have an item and control total and a hash total, and then the input controls for processing. Okay, so the user-controlled activities can be used to test the completeness and accuracy of an IT process transaction. So remember the completeness, the direction that you would test for completeness. I'm thinking of a previous chapter, but I'm trying to cue you into the idea of tests for completeness. So you know the direction. I wonder if you can remember that. Just throwing it out there. Okay. And then we talk about monitoring the IT environment. Monitoring is the process of assessing all IT performance over time and seeing if the programs are doing what they're set out to do, and also for the accounting department, reducing the risk of material misstatement. And then we talk about cloud computing. So cloud computing means that we don't have a server or database hopping around, and that we use the internet to store our information. And cloud computing can be used usually with a provider. So in order to implement cloud controls, you would have to work directly with the provider. Okay. They talk about centralized and single workstation systems. That is not the optimal situation for an accountant. Try not to have those as much as possible, but they're definitely out there because it's something that you can't just go hop into without having to get the user information. And I think the little fraud video, will really kind of speak to this. So I'm not going to say too much on single station. So when you're doing it for the audit, again, you want to obtain an understanding of the IT system using the control environment within it. And there are ways you could do it. You can look at the complexity through a flow chart or a program chart, or you can do control questionnaires. So again, you want to identify risks of material misstatement, relate the identified tasks, consider the magnitude of the material misstatement, and the likelihood that the risks could result in a material misstatement. And then computer manually processing selected transactions and comparing it to computer output. So again, that's what you would be doing if you were doing the manual tests and controls. That's pretty much all I want to talk about in this. Take a look at the audit procedure versus the basic inventory. And again, appreciate your time. This was a short chapter, but I've also added a 23-minute forensic accounting type show for you to watch. So that'll give you some good lecture this week. Hope you're having a great chapter 8. Appreciate you listening to my lecture today. Take care now. Thanks.